For 25 years, visitors to Sydney were greeted by a monorail running through the city streets and around Darling Harbour. This is until 2013, when the monorail was demolished, never to run again. But why was it demolished? Why was it there in the first place? What did people think of it? And will a monorail ever return to Sydney? The answers to these questions and more in a moment. Hello sir, would you like to buy some Finnish phrase books?
So then, mono means one, and rail means rail. Well, sir, there's nothing on earth like a genuine, bona fide, electrified six-car monorail. What'd I say?
Monorail.
What's it called?
Monorail.
That's right, monorail.
Monorail, 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 monorail.
I swear it's
monorail,
Springfield's only
monorail,
choice. Throw up
monorail,
your hands and
monorail,
raise your voice. What's it called?
Monorail, monorail,
Once again.
monorail, 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 monorail,
But Main
monorail.
Street's still all cracked and broken. Sorry, Mom. The mob is spoken.
Hi, hello, how are you? In 1826, the area of Cockle Bay to the west of the Sydney city centre was named Darling Harbour. This was to commemorate Ralph Darling, the Governor of New South Wales who ran the colony under martial law. Some of his more notable practices as governor were torturing prisoners and banning theatre entertainment. As you can imagine of someone with these unique qualities, he decided to name the harbour after himself, though presumably this was after the name Ralph Water failed to catch on. For many years, the land was part of Sydney's main freight port, used for railways and warehouses, bringing in all sorts of goods from across the world and sending them on their way throughout the continent. But by the late 1970s, the port had become mostly disused due to the construction of a large container terminal in Botany Bay to the south.
Darling Harbour? Well, you can find some cheap drugs there, but it's a dump.
A state government inquiry decided that the land should be used for public purposes. By 1984, plans were in place for a picturesque new waterfront precinct full of parks and shops and restaurants and a convention centre, among other attractions. The Darling Harbour Authority was set up to realise this in time for Australia's bicentennial celebrations in 1988. The planners were faced with an important problem. How would people get to this fantastic new development? Several developers came forward with suggestions, and by July 1985, the choice was down to two. A monorail line looping around the city centre and the new developments of Darling Harbour, or a light rail running from Central Station around the western side of the harbour, across Piedmont Bridge and to Wynyard Station, with the possibilities of extending to Circular Quay and completing the loop around Darling Harbour. The Labor government of the time thought very hard about it and then decided on the monorail, and in 1986 construction began. The monorail took travel somewhat literally to a new dimension. It avoided congesting the busy Sydney streets by riding above them. The sleek, futuristic carriages were electric, so they were quiet and non-polluting. Even more exciting and futuristic was the fact that they would run completely automatically. Everything including driving the train, opening and closing the doors, and adjusting the floor height for different platforms was done by a computer in the system's central control room. The project was to be run by Australian company TNT, using a system designed and manufactured by Swiss company Von Roll Holding. Importantly, TNT would build and operate the monorail at no cost to the government and thereby the taxpayer. There would be 6 stations, with plans for 2 more to open later. Trains would run every 2 minutes and complete the 3.5-kilometre route in 12 minutes. Initially, 6 trains would run simultaneously, though the system was capable of expanding up to 9 trains if needed. The monorail opened on the 21st of July 1988. There was a big party with lots of balloons and everyone was served monorail-shaped cake. So now that the monorails were running, how did they go? Before we can get to that, there's more than just happy mono-winged butterflies and monocoloured rainbows to talk about in this monorail-laden world. There's a lot of things, a lot of curious, interesting things that they haven't yet told you about this Sydney monorail. What I've told you up to now was what the state government said about the monorail, and a lot of it was true, but it doesn't tell the whole story. The two schemes were substantially different. The monorail was more expensive, but would cost nothing to the government, and avoided congesting Sydney's streets. Did I mention it was also exciting and futuristic? Light rail would have cost around half the price, as well as being cheaper for a ticket. It also would have carried more people further, all the way from Central to Wynyard train stations, and would have been easier to expand. Multiple reports were commissioned by the government, many of which criticised the plan for the monorail. Other reports responded favourably to the light rail. Despite this, the Minister for Public Works, Laurie Brereton, continually insisted that its cost to the taxpayer would be too high. It was later found that the committee in charge over-scrutinised the light rail concept in comparison to the monorail and consistently overestimated its costs. So why did the people in charge so heavily prefer the monorail? Well, aside maybe from putting Sydney on the map,
I've sold monorails to Brockway, Ogdenville, and North Haverbrook, and by gum, it put them on the map.
Even a Sydney Morning Herald article from 2 months before the monorail opened reported there was no clear reason. However, it may have something to do with the fact that TNT was owned by Peter Apologise, a good friend of Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke.
Bob and I were great mates. We used to ring up the Queen and pretend we were Kiwis asking for extra sheep. The deal negotiated between TNT and the government agreed that TNT would pay for the construction, but there would be no government intervention in ticket pricing. It also stipulated that any cost overrun would be covered by the government.
But this would only be a small amount in case any emergencies impeded the construction process, right? $20 million was the budget overrun paid by the government. This would have been enough to build the light rail proposal anyway, but the problems didn't end there. The monorail was scheduled to open on the 1st of January 1988, well in time for Darling Harbour's royal opening in May. To ensure it opened on time, the government passed a new law in November of 1985, effectively overriding 13 other laws on heritage protection, environment and planning, the authority of the Sydney City Council, and even traffic and fire safety.
Popular opinion was quite divided, with around as many people supporting the monorail as objecting to it. Of particular concern was the impact the monorail infrastructure would have on the city streets and historic buildings. Marches were organised, with over 10,000 people gathering to protest the monorail.
But it was to no avail. Eventually the monorail opened, 7 months off schedule, and 2 months after the Queen came to officially open Darling Harbour. So now we know the real story of how Sydney got its monorail. But how did it go once it was open?
TNT anticipated 12 million passengers a year, but for the first few years the monorail barely carried half that many. Due to a litany of technical issues, the crucial promise of complete automation was scrapped within the first 6 months. Monorail drivers initially had to stand at the front of the train, but were later generously given a stool, and then a chair.
Despite the monorail's fairly mediocre opening, some optimists believed that this was the future of public transport.
Professor Rolf Jensen of the University of Adelaide proposed monorails to run above many major roads out to the suburbs. There was even a plan to run a monorail over the arch of the Harbour Bridge.
The whole metropolis was going monorail mad, but none of these other schemes ever got on the rail. The first city centre station was temporary and suspended up there above Pitt Street while the building next to it was being redeveloped. This wasn't uncommon. Other stations at World Square and Park Plaza weren't fully finished until more than 10 years after the network opened. The casino station was planned, unsurprisingly, at the proposed site of Sydney's casino. Interestingly, one of the bidders for this was Donald Trump, but he was rejected as, among other concerns, he was considered to have links to the mafia. Luckily, Trump never gained any prominent power beyond his business career. The station opened with the name Darling Park in 1992, as the casino development was moved across the harbour to Pyrmont.
During the 90s, the monorail quietly shuffled along, never making a large profit but not really hemorrhaging money either. Public outrage mellowed as it was realised it would cost far more to get rid of the monorail than just leave it there. After 2 years of a coin and token-based system, the monorail card was developed by Wayne Ferguson. This was actually a great system. Money could be stored on the card, which worked with a magnetic strip like this Officeworks card I have.
This was more than 20 years before the Opal card was released across New South Wales Transport, and an actual working example of the monorail's futuristic ideals, even if it had nothing really to do with the monorail.
During the mid-90s, TNT dealt with financial difficulties and were taken over in 1996 by their international business partner, the Dutch government-owned postal company KPN. In 1998, they sold the monorail to a combinatorial venture by the Sydney Light Rail Company and CGA Transport. They rebranded it to the Metro Monorail to match with the company's existing Metro Light Rail. The new owners decided that the monorail had failed as a viable transport option and instead marketed it as more of a tourist attraction. They limited the network from 6 trains at a time to 4, increasing the wait to around 4 minutes. They also allowed monorail cars to feature body advertising rather than the simple colour scheme used before.
All sorts of wild marketing campaigns were used to advertise the monorail. One of these was in 2004, when for 2 months the monorail was used as a venue for speed dating. Love may very well have been in the air. In 2001, the final planned station, Garden Plaza, opened within the No. 1 Dixon shopping centre, but it closed in 2004. In 2006, it reopened again as Chinatown, but by 2012 it was unmanned and only open on weekday mornings.
In 2012, the New South Wales government bought the monorail so they could freely demolish it in order to make way for light rail and a new Sydney Convention Centre. Minister for Transport Gladys Berejiklian explained that the monorail had never been integrated enough into the rest of the state's transport system. The last month of the monorail's operation was June 2013. Ridership doubled compared to previous months, but the monorail closed after the final ride on the night of June 30th, 2013.
So why was it that the monorail was such a rubbish transport system? Well, I can think of four main reasons. Firstly, the monorail was expensive. Or only $1 a trip in 1988, by 1990 the cost for a single trip had doubled to $2, which is around $4 today. In 2013, a single trip on the monorail cost $5, which is around $6 in today's money. This was partly due to the government giving up any right to intervene in pricing as part of the original contract. Secondly, the monorail was prominent, to say the least. Through Sydney's narrow streets, it stuck out like a monorail through a narrow street. The merits of the system's aesthetic value are always subjective, but the pylons and monorail track did stick out a bit and may have been a bit ugly. This, alongside its delayed and controversial development, meant that the monorail was never very well liked. The monorail was notoriously unreliable. In its first 5 months, it broke down 9 times. Its history of disruptions was bumpier than trying to ride a Sydney bus. Von-roll monorails were only previously seen in amusement parks in a few small cities. The Sydney monorail was the first time it was used as public transport, which may have exacerbated flaws in its design. Lastly, and most importantly, the monorail failed to be a viable method of transport as it simply wasn't useful enough. The monorail needed to take people from where they were, or other transport links, to where they needed to go, and get them there in a reasonable time for a reasonable cost.
While there was no quick and direct transfer between trains on the monorail, most monorail stations in the city were at most a few minutes' walk from train stations.
Getting people to the monorail, while not as efficient as it could have been, wasn't a huge issue. What was an issue was getting people onto the monorail.
The system from the outset was criticised as too small. The longest stretch of the monorail was only a little more than a kilometre. Darling Harbour failed to flourish as was planned and lacked new development. There simply wasn't enough reason for many people to go.
This wasn't the only case of stalling development. One of the original 6 stations was World Square, but the World Square shopping mall it was built to serve didn't open until more than 17 years after the network opened. The casino station was built, but the casino never came, and the area surrounding the station has always been pretty dull. Perhaps most egregiously, the system ran on a single counterclockwise loop, meaning that for shorter clockwise trips, it was easier to just walk.
Let's take the example of Jim, who's just finished his latest bout of problem gambling at the Star Casino. He needs to meet his cocaine dealer at Pitt Street. From the nearest station, Harbourside, he has 2 options. He can walk for about 8 to 10 minutes for free, or get there on the monorail in about the same time for $5. With Jim succumbing to a loosely regulated and predatory gambling industry, he'll find it hard to justify spending money on the monorail.
Given how much a ticket cost, the use case for the monorail was pretty limited. In its latest years, the monorail was estimated to have only 9% commuter traffic, and a 2013 state transport report estimated that its demolishing would only add 60 to 100 daily commuters to existing public transport. I had a chance to speak with one of those commuters.
Yeah, it's a shame really. The monorail's really my only option.
Really?
Yeah, I have this rare genetic condition that means I can't travel on transport that runs on 2 rails.
Of course, dear reader, I know now the question that most pervasively penetrates the innards of your mental faculties. Namely, now that the monorail is gone, how is Darling Harbour served by public transport?
In 1997, the Sydney Light Rail was opened, travelling from Central Station to the western side of Pyrmont. This also reduced the monorail's ridership, as it followed the same route as the monorail for a few stops, and went further, making it a more convenient commuting option. In 2014, the light rail was extended, now travelling down to Dulwich Hill in the inner west. Sydney's second light rail line opened in 2019, operating from Circular Quay to Wynyard Central, then on to the eastern suburbs. You'll notice now that the 2 lines quite closely cover the original plans for the light rail in the 80s. The monorail may have been futuristic, but it's clear now that the light rail design was more ahead of its time.
These light rail lines are really good.
They solved the monorail's problem of being too small by extending into areas otherwise poorly served by Sydney's public transport system, which has for far too long relied too heavily on buses. I hate buses.
So what can you see of the monorail today?
This is all that's left of one of the crappiest trains ever built.
All of the rails and pylons were demolished just after the monorail closed. The only noticeable signs of them are these big asphalt squares all across Pyrmont Bridge where the pylons used to be.
The Paddy's Markets, Convention and City Centre stations have all been demolished or renovated without a trace of the monorail.
The Galleries at Victoria Station is now a gym, and coming up the escalator you can vaguely see how this might have been a monorail station.
Outside, you can clearly see the change in brickwork where the station used to be.
World Square Station is still here. It's been a part of the building since construction, so its demolition has been too complicated to bother with. The area around the station is quite cramped and out of the way of anything to do at the mall, so it's not surprising to see it entirely deserted. Looking a bit closer, you can see a sign in the old Metro Monorail colours.
The lift from the station still works, but the button to take you up to the platform sadly doesn't.
Travelling to Chinatown Station was an interesting experience. Hello?
Go away. Ain't no monorail here and there never was.
The two most interesting stations are either end of Piedmont Bridge.
Peeking inside the stations where you still can is like travelling back in time 9 years. It's actually really cool with the turnstiles and advertising and their classic cylindrical station design all still present.
I really do suggest taking a look at these if you're interested, as they're both planned to be demolished at some point in the future. The monorail was ultimately an interesting experiment, full of 80s optimistic futurism that, like most things of the era, didn't turn out as revolutionary as some people hoped. Had it been larger and travelled in two directions, it would have been more intrusive and expensive, but it's possible it would have stayed up until today and been as iconic to Sydney as the Harbour Bridge or the Opera House. But as a result of its shortcomings, it's likely that any new plans for a monorail will be quickly shot down, and a monorail will never return to Sydney. Why get back here? Thanks for watching. In its latest years, the monorail... Oh, I feel like we're going to